Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
We are getting ready to open our Profiler Training certification course. And we want to take some time in this podcast to tell you a little bit about that, be a little more direct with what's going to be happening in that course. But also, anytime we do something here at Personality Hacker, we love to give value, even if you decide not to do something with us, like take a course, for example. We want to give you value just for being around, because that's one of our core values, is giving value back to you as a listener. And so today we want to talk a little bit about profiler training and what that entails, but go into some of the specifics around how we think about typing people and maybe some techniques and some strategies that you can use regardless if you end up taking our profiler training class or course in your own life when you're maybe on a date or with your family or meeting people. You can then look at these people and say, I've got a better type guess on them because of some of the things that Joel and Antonia just talked about in this podcast. So that's one of the things we want to do today, is give you some value around this and also illustrate to you just how powerful it is to understand deep, profiling somebody in real time. It's a really powerful skill, a powerful tool set that we've seen people use in their personal lives, in their coaching practices, and with their family and friends. And it's a really interesting experience. So we're going to go ahead and jump right into this, but just wanted to tell you right out of the gate that's what we're going to be talking about today.
So one of the things we talk about in the Profiler Training Certification course is that everybody is profiling all the time. We can't help it. We naturally put people in oversimplified categories in order to understand them, because humans are too complex and complicated to do anything else. Like, if we really, truly tried to understand another person's experience, we would spend a lifetime getting inside of their mind. I mean, we're inside of our own minds all the time anyway, and we don't really even fully understand ourselves unless we have some tools and maps and models to go off of. So everybody is essentially typing everybody else all the time. That's how we understand the overcomplicated nature of humanity. What's interesting about using methods like typology systems, personality typology systems, is that we have some patterns that can be recognized beyond our own, basic observations. Like, a lot of times, one of the exercises we do in the course is we ask our students to name 5 different ways that people are profiling each other all the time. And almost always the top 5 are gender, how the person is dressed or their grooming, the kind of car they drive, or their socioeconomic level that is illustrated by the car, their race, and then name a 5th one. Like, sometimes it's education, sometimes it's what part of the country or the world they live in.
The accent they use or the way they speak.
Right. There's usually like the 5th one's a wild card, but those 4 show up over and over and over again. And those are the most basic, obvious components of another human being. They're very shallow. What's nice about using personality typology systems is that even if you're not right the first time, you're at least attempting to go underneath the hood. You're at least attempting to go on a deeper level. You recognize that this other person is complex, and they are more than just their race or their gender or their socioeconomic status, that there's something even deeper going on for this individual. So one of the reasons why typology systems are so powerful is it's a enforced reminder that people are not just what they appear to be. There's something more going on there. So what's nice about typology, and the reason why, Joel mentioned it's so powerful, it's powerful because we can't stay in the shallow. We can't stay in the shallows. We have to go deeper if we're going to implement these systems. And when you do it well, then you really get a taste for another person's experience. You really get to get in there and really understand what it must be like or might be like for the other person. In order to be a really exceptional profiler or somebody who types other people, one of the things you have to do is try to get into the various cognitive functions that each of the types use. You have to get really into those cognitive function experiences. Try to emulate them inside yourself. So even if you're never going to use all of the functions the same way that a person using one of those as their dominant process is using it, even if you can never get to that point, you're still getting a taste of what it must be like to be somebody who uses that on a regular basis. So instead of overvaluing our own experience and projecting our experience onto other people, we now recognize that they might be playing in a completely different sandbox. We can't always expect them to come to us. We recognize that, especially as we build these tools, it's actually our responsibility to go to them.
Now, you are listening and you might be going, wait a minute, Antonia, you just talked about something called a cognitive function. I'm a new listener. I'm confused. What in the world do you mean? I know Myers-Briggs, for example, by that 4-letter code that I've been given on a test I took. And now you're talking about this cognitive functions and these ways of, profiling people using that. What in the world are you talking about? One of the best things you could do real quick is to run over to personalityhacker.com and put in the search bar car model. It's going to bring up an article and some resources around a framework we use that will illustrate what we're talking about here. But basically, just if you don't have time to do that right now or you're in the car driving or something, a cognitive function is the way your mental wiring shows up in your personality. And that 4-letter code, let's say you're an INTJ in the Myers-Briggs system, that INTJ code tells us how your mind is wired. Basically, that's what we're looking for with that code. So it tells us how you learn information and how you make decisions. And when we talk about our profiler training certification course, we're going way beyond the tip of the iceberg, which is that 4-letter code, down into the underpinnings or the underwiring of your mind, how you're learning information, how you're making decisions, and the behaviors you exhibit from those are just that. They're behaviors. It's not actually how your mind's working. It's it's exhibiting how your mind's working. So 2 very different types might have the same behavior, but they're doing it for different reasons. And that's why we get down to the level of cognitive functions. It's extremely powerful. It gives you a lot of power in the profiling process and learning someone's type and helping them maybe grow through that or understand themselves or understand yourself better. It's a really powerful framework for using in the typing experience. And so that's what she's talking about here.
Yeah, so that's a good thing to keep in mind as we talk about this. What I want to do now, though, is I do want to go to those dichotomies and that 4-letter code. And I want to give you some what we call profiling principles, some of the things that you can observe in a person's behavior or mannerisms or how they're showing up that will make you or help you become better at typing somebody just through observation. So in the course, we have something that we call we make a distinction between 2 things that we call passive profiling and active profiling. Passive profiling is observing a person's behavior and taking a stab at their type based on just passively observing them. And then active profiling is going through a conversation. It starts out early on through asking questions, and sometimes they're forced choice, which means A or B, and then just trying to suss the person's type by how they answer those things. But eventually it gets to what's called conversational profiling, which is asking people questions that encourage them to open up how their mind is working, and then using that as a gauge to, run down different roads and kind of chase what we call low-hanging fruit. What is the most obvious component of their personality, and then building it based on that, maybe doing some reverse engineering and figuring out what's going on with a person's behavior. But right now we're just going to talk about passive profiling, and we're going to use those 4 different dichotomies in introversion, extroversion, sensing, intuition, thinking, feeling, and judging, perceiving, and talk about some of the things you can observe a person's energy or observe their behaviors or how they're showing up, and use those to help determine a person's type.
Now, the accuracy of this is going to be less than active profiling, obviously, because you aren't sitting down with someone you're looking at from afar or watching, observing. You're not asking them direct questions about how their mind is wired. And often this is what we're seeing online with celebrity typing and typing politicians and the different people that we see in the world or each other. Oftentimes it is passive profiling. And the only tool that most people have are the dichotomies. So already you have a little bit less accuracy than active profiling. But what we're going to talk about right now is going to give you more accuracy and more things you can look at to improve that passive profiling process. Even though it's not a perfect science or art, you can improve it. And so that's what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah. Well, the best way to determine whether or not you're accurate is to do an active profiling session and verify, which is not always possible. Or you can have the person tell you their best fit type themselves, which is, of course, also not always possible because they might not know. But passive profiling is it's like a fun, engaging, and entry-level tool to be able to get better at figuring out people's types. So let's start with the first one, the first dichotomy of introversion and extroversion. I'm just going to give you quick little, tips, tricks, little observations you can make in order to determine these four. And so we'll start with that one. So the primary difference between introversion and extroversion, and we talk a lot about, in the Myers-Briggs world or in the community of type, most of the time, introversion and extroversion is put down to how a person is managing their energy. That's generally how people talk about it. Introverts need alone time for energy management, and extroverts need to be around people or engaged in the outside world for energy management. And we feel like there's a layer underneath that, and that is which world is the real world. Now, a lot of people may or may not agree with that foundational or etymological place, but the reason why we feel like that's the layer underneath, and when you say layer underneath, I mean like truly subterranean, like on a level that is very deeply unconscious for us that we don't usually think about, which is one of the reasons why people may or may not agree with that, because they're not really thinking about that very subterranean level. But this is how we see it. For introverts, the inner world is the real world. And for extroverts, the outer world is the real world. The reason why introverts need alone time for energy management is that if the inner world is the real world and you go into the outer world and get pieces of information that don't gel with how you feel about that thing, then that means that you have to go to the trouble of trying to reconcile these two contradicting pieces of information. Why is the outer world contradicting how I feel inside? And that takes effort, right? There's energy expended in trying to reconcile those two pieces of information. Think of it as like a ledger in an accounting statement. You've got to try to figure out why the two columns are not adding up. And that takes brain wattage, it takes energy, it takes time. So for an introvert, in order to get full energy, they have to be alone away from that reconciliation process. They have to be in a space where they don't have to reconcile these two ledgers and expend energy figuring that out, which is why some introverts can be quote unquote alone when they're with their pair bond partner. They've remapped their inner world to include that person. And the reason why they love being around that person so much is because that person doesn't ever force them to have to reconcile the outer world and the inner world, because that person might just agree with everything they think. And so if a person is that mapped to your inner world experience, you can be alone and be with them at the same time, because they're no longer technically part of the outer world for you. For extroverts, they don't have to go through that reconciliation process. In fact, if they don't get outer world feedback, for an extrovert, that's where you figure out how things work. That's where you figure out how things are supposed to be laid out. So if you don't get enough of that, you're not getting fueled, because you're not really in touch with the world that makes sense to you. You're not really in touch with the world that is the ultimate arbiter of reality. So for an introvert, the inner world is the ultimate arbiter of reality. And for an extrovert, the outer world is the ultimate arbiter of reality. Now, this changes a little bit in the dynamics depending upon, which of your functions you're leading with. If you're leading with an extroverted, say, what's called a judging process, that might be a little different than an extroverted perceiving process. And that's the same thing plays out for an introverted judging process versus an introverted perceiving process. So those are technical names for how this plays out. So it changes a little bit in the dynamic, whatever cognitive functions you're using. But fundamentally, on a dichotomy level, that's where we see it.
From a practical standpoint, then, you just mentioned this, it changes a little bit what again, cognitive functions you're using. There may be somebody who is an extrovert, who the real world is the outside world for them, but they're not necessarily a people person. And they're wired because maybe their extroverted process, as an example, an ETJ in the Myers-Briggs system would be using a cognitive function that is extroverted thinking as their primary way of engaging with the world. They are an extrovert, but extroverted thinking is a thinking process. It takes in all sorts of information. People are one of the components it takes in, but it's also looking at structural things. It's also looking at how things work and function and processes and systems and results. And it's looking at all of this in the outside world. And that person might show up as not a quote unquote people person, life of the party, and yet they're still an extrovert. So when you're typing, you're passively profiling, These are the things you can be watching out for. Just because someone doesn't like to spend time around people doesn't, by definition, make them an introvert, as an example.
Yeah, implementation for ETJs is the most important component of their extroverted experience. You can be implementing without engaging with another human being. So using socializing as and your threshold for socializing as a way to gauge an introvert versus an extrovert is a red herring. That's a lot of times what people use. And even a person who maybe like take, for example, an ENP that's leading with extroverted intuition. That can be that's a function that works on novelty. Now, we're not talking about functions and typing based on functions in this podcast. We're trying to give examples of why the traditional typology methods generally don't play out in the real world, because there's this other component of cognitive functions. So if you're using extroverted intuition, which is what ENPs use, and you're in a context that's socializing but only talking small talk or talking about very mundane topics, your energy will just get sapped like crazy. So some ENPs think they're introverts because they have a very low threshold for traditional small talk style engagement. And it's because it's sapping their energy, not because they're introverts, but because it's pulling from, or it's taking energy from that dominant process that wants to be fueling itself on novelty. So the traditional style of just using people's social threshold for profiling is actually quite inaccurate. A much better gauge for using introversion and extroversion, or trying to figure that out, is to see how much, and this is going to feel a little abstract at first, but to see how much energy that person is willing to push out to the outer world. So that can be seen in a person's vocal tonality. Do they have any problem projecting on a general basis? Like, you can tell Joel and I are extroverts because we have no problem projecting. When people think out loud, not mumble to themselves, but actually talk to another person in order to gauge their thoughts. When they're thinking out loud and they're doing so with a projected tonality. When they have larger mannerisms. What these are signs of is it's comfort expending energy in the outside world, the world that is real to them. So energy expenditure in the outside world is not going to come back to bite an extrovert.
In fact, it's rewarded usually.
Exactly. But for an introvert, the outer world and expending energy in the outer world might actually come back to haunt them, in the sense that for an introvert, because they're doing that reconciliation process, if an introvert says something that is inaccurate, that does not, inaccurate for them, I mean, that doesn't resonate with how they feel inside, if they project that to the outer world and their ears now catch that, it means they now have to do a reconciliation process with those two ledgers, and they created that problem. Like, they created that moment of energy expenditure. So introverts at a very early age unconsciously pick this up. And what they do in order to prevent as much of that as possible is they withhold their energy. They bring it in tight to the center of reality for them, or their inner world. So their mannerisms end up being smaller. Their vocal tonality ends up not being as forced unless they're in, say, a performance setting where that's necessary. If you're talking about performance, or if you're talking about building a skill around public speaking, all bets are off, all right? Public speaking is not usually, I mean, you can tell sometimes, but if a person is like a lot of skill in public speaking, you can't tell if they're an introvert or extrovert from that. But if you're just talking to them normally, you're going to see certain things that indicate a tightness of energy. So not opening up their mouth as much for their vowels, right? I just opened my mouth. When I used the word, or when I said the word vowel, I just moved the corner of my mouth quite wide. It's because I've never really thought about it, but introverts do. So they have a tendency to keep the corners of their mouth a little tighter when they're speaking in vocal tonality. They have a tendency to not project their energy out as much. They have a tendency to keep all their energy a little tighter to the center. And the reason for that is because why would they want to foist upon themselves the energetic hit of trying to reconcile something that they blasted out to the outer world that they now recognize does not resonate with how they feel internally?
And just like with extroverts who may not be people-focused extroverts, and so you can mistype them. You can see them and go, well, they're not hanging around people. They're not the life of the party. They, by definition, are an introvert. I've seen introverts who, in order to keep that reconciliation process from happening, they're very chatty. They don't necessarily project a loud voice, but they talk a lot. And you're like, wow, this person is talking with people constantly. They're in this almost stream of consciousness speaking experience that's going on here. This must be an extrovert I'm talking to because they're just chatty. But what's actually happening is it's that introvert potentially using language and talking so they don't have to get feedback in some situations that feel uncomfortable. And that way that reconciliation process is not needed. So it's a strategy sometimes that can look very extroverted or people-focused, but it's a strategy to prevent having to do that reconciliation energy work.
Well, and then another sign would also be a person who does quite well in a social situation, and it doesn't matter how rewarding the socializing was, they're exhausted at the end of it.
Yeah.
So even if they enjoyed every moment of it, afterwards there's a recovery process. Mm-hmm. That's an introvert. For an extrovert, if they are enjoying every moment of socializing, they're going to get a high from it. So there are certain things that are basically indicators or markers of introversion and extroversion that have little to do with how a person is showing up while they're in the socializing that we talked about. And it's more about how they're showing up energetically. What is their energy? Now, an introvert can get really boosted in the moment of socializing. I've seen some like IFJs do this, where everything about the situation is very rewarding to extroverted feeling, which would be their co-pilot process. But then afterwards, they still get that, they have to take that energetic hit. So when you are typing people, if you want to become a more proficient profiler or a person who's typing another person, don't look for the red herrings. Look for the energy. How is the person managing their energy even in a social situation where it appears as if they're quite social? Are they keeping their energy close to the core of who they are, like close to the center point? Or are they very energetically cavalier? And even if they're not talking, do they appear energetically cavalier? Like they have no problem having this energy sort of just come out of them and just blast out of them. There are markers of this, like I said, vocal tonality, smaller vowels, right? Keeping the energy in, smaller gestures, that sort of thing. But also controlling a context. You mentioned somebody who was an introvert that wanted to basically dominate the conversation to prevent having to get feedback. That's a strategy of controlling the conversation. If you're doing passive profiling and you see somebody who's controlling the conversation, it's a mistake to assume that person is an extrovert. Look for some of the other clues to see if they're controlling the conversation, not to control the group, but rather to control how much feedback they have to get. So it's more about the input-output piece than it is about the actual socializing. And
again, we're only talking about the dichotomies, but there is so much fidelity when you bring in the cognitive function level that really gives nuance to just this, are you an introvert or extrovert? Well, really, there's a lot of variance there, and there's a lot of elements that come out when you really study this and begin to use it in your life and in your profiling aspects that give you so much more fidelity.
Right.
So let's go ahead and move on to the second letter in the 4-letter code, in the dichotomies. And this is the part of you that perceives the world. This is your perceiving way of seeing the world. This is what you see. So you're either seeing the world through a sensory framework, which is the S for this, or you're seeing something through an intuitive framework, which is the N in the 4-letter code. So you're either going to be an N or an S here. And sensors, people that see the world using their senses, are relying upon literally their 5 senses and the other senses we have, like sense of balance and sense of time and other things that we bring in. All of us use our senses to perceive the world. But what sensors are looking for is verifiable and reliable sensory information to perceive their world. So things like, can I actually pick it up and touch it? Does it exist? Doesn't have to be necessarily in front of me. I might see a video or a photograph of it, but is it real? Is it something that's tangible and real? Is it verifiable? I can see sensory people going through the world very interested in the sensation of their experience. You know, what am I observing? How is my body responding to the inputs around it? A lot of athletes might have this as a process that they use. They're perceiving the world in real time. It's very tangible. It's very visceral for them. And there's different versions of this, but it's a very sensory way of seeing the world. Now, contrast that with someone who uses intuition, who also has sensation. They sense the world. Obviously, we have eyes and ears and taste and smell. But what intuitives are doing, they're taking a lot of that sensation that's coming into them, and they're using it to discover the patterns that are happening that may not be verifiable or sensory based in the here and now. And they're looking to see what is behind the curtain. What is going on behind the curtain that I can't actually perceive in front of me? I can't point to it and say, yes, that's exactly what's happening because there is the verifiable information, or here's the sensory input. It's speculative in nature because it's by definition behind the curtain. So what intuitive that shows up in the world gets really good at doing is guessing at what is probably going on behind the curtain based on the information, the limited information that they have available to them. And this creates a lot of what if or speculative ways of thinking. So is where someone who's a sensor is interested in what is the verifiable, the here and now, the tangible. An intuitive is often very interested in what is not tangible. What is the what if scenario? What if this happened? What is the insight I can gain from this happening here? What am I looking at behind the curtain? And what are the patterns that I can guess about what's going on? That's the difference between these two types. And so you can already see from a profiling standpoint, these are some of the markers you're going to look for. And there's some nuance in how you would look for them, because oftentimes they can be confusing when you're first starting out in passive profiling.
So one of the easiest ways or markers to determine whether or not somebody is a sensor or an intuitive is to engage someone in abstract conversation, like speculative what-if conversation. And what is the person's threshold for that style of conversation? So it's not that sensors will not engage in abstract or speculative conversation, and it's not that intuitives will not engage in more grounded conversation. It's what is the person's threshold for that? And the easiest way to do so is to default to the speculative, because more people are sensors than they are intuitives. And so intuitives have a tendency to learn how to have a higher threshold for grounded conversation, just as sort of a life survival technique. But sensors are not as required to go the opposite direction. Even if they were a sensor that was raised in, say, an all-intuitive household, they might have a higher threshold because they have acclimated to that. But there will almost always be a point or a moment when the person is just sort of done. Like they cannot force themselves to care anymore. Whereas an intuitive will use that as nourishment or food. So if you want to gauge another person in whether or not they're a sensor and intuitive through passive profiling, first you notice what kinds of conversations that they are generating themselves if given an opportunity. So what is the kind of thing they want to talk about if they've got the floor? And then after that, gauge how long they will hold those conversations. What is their threshold for something speculative versus what is their threshold for something that is concrete or more grounded conversation? And you'll notice that an intuitive, while they might be able to hold a conversation in a more concrete or grounded way, they might be able to hold it. There will be no energy that comes from them because they're not being energetically fueled by it. Whereas if an intuitive is in a speculative conversation, you'll notice that they get more and more excited as they go. And they can hold that for quite a long time. I would argue hours. If an intuitive is in a speculative conversation, they can literally go for hours, and that includes an introvert. If a sensor is an intuitive conversation, I think I've noticed that even if intuition is something that is not what's technically called your inferior process, if it's your tertiary process, I've noticed that they can hang on and handle and stay engaged and have a threshold of approximately 45 minutes to an hour and a half. Usually at approximately the 45-minute mark is when they start powering down or they just start losing interest. It just doesn't have meaning for them anymore. And if they're what's called a sensory primary, or if it's their dominant cognitive function, they usually have a lot less. A threshold for it. So if you're doing passive profiling, what are the kinds of conversations the person is bringing up if given the floor? And then what is the overarching conversation that's going on, and how is the person engaged in that? What are they powering up or are they powering down?
Yeah, you're on a date with someone and you want to just kind of do a quick passive profiling on them. And let's say you're an intuitive, just start throwing some what if speculative questions out to your date and just say, so what if, we could colonize the moon in 20 years? What do you think the implications of that would be politically on this planet? I mean, something random like that. And just, it's not really what they say, it's how they take that energy and how long they're willing to go down that road with you, for example, whatever that speculative thing you throw out is. And again, I think you're right on to that, Antonia. That's a much better way to go because less people have intuition. So about 25% of the population, as far as we can tell, the numbers bear out. And that's going to give you a much clearer indicator of intuition showing up, whether they're able to spar with you there and continue to talk along those lines. So that's something you could do like on a date, for example.
Yeah. And what is the person naturally interested in if given their own devices? So I remember having a Twitter conversation with someone on whether or not Anthony Robbins was an ESFP or an ENFP. And my speculation doing passive profiling with Anthony Robbins, and I don't know this because I've never profiled him. And by the way, when it comes to celebrity types, unless I've personally met the person, I won't give a type guess, like, definitively. I just won't do it unless I've, like, met them and engaged with them and felt their energy. But my suspicion is that Anthony Robbins is an ENFP and not an ESFP. Now, it's very popular or very common to hear Anthony Robbins being called an ESFP. And the reason why I feel like he's more likely to be an ENFP is because I've read his books. So it's not just the energy he shows up with on stage. It's not just what he's able to, to talk about on stage when he's hosting and guiding and group coaching like 1,000-person audience. When he wrote a book, which is him at his most authentic, these are the ideas he wants to bring out to the world. Everything that he wrote in, say, Awaken the Giant Within felt very intuitive to me. It was he didn't call it neuro-linguistic programming or NLP because I don't think he was, like, by law allowed to.
I think he got sued.
Yeah, I think he got sued and had to change it. But he called it, I can't remember what he called it. It's basically neuro-linguistic programming.
Neuro-something conditioning. I can't remember the middle word.
Yeah, he just changed the name. But like all the principles around NLP are extremely intuitive principles. There's nothing about NLP that you can look at some of the patterns that emerge. You can see some of the markers, but this is a very behind the curtain concept. And he just basically just dropped a lot of those intuitive bombs all throughout his book, Awaken the Giant Within. So to do good passive profiling also requires like looking into the deeper level if you can. What do you know about this person? If they're an actor or if they're somebody on TV and you're trying to passive profile them, what do you know about how they show up in an interview? Not simply how they're showing up in like on stage. What are the kinds of things they're talking about? Have they written a book? What were the things they chose to talk about in their book? And that will give you a really good gauge on whether or not a person is a sensor or an intuitive. So the third dichotomy is thinking and feeling, and this is the root of what was called your judging process, where your judging process lives. But we're not going to talk about the judging processes. We're just going to talk about the dichotomy of thinking and feeling. And because this is the root of your judging process.
When you say judging, you mean decision-making, because we're going to talk about judgers in a minute here, or J's. You
That's
mean
right.
Decision-making process.
That's right. We call the judging cognitive function the decision-making process in order to distinguish it from judging and perceiving. And if you don't go too far down the rabbit's hole on that, it can be very confusing. The further down you get, the more you understand why some of these terms are used multiple different styles and ways. But on a less deep level, let's call it the decision-making cognitive function. And so that means that thinking and feeling are basically criteria you're using to evaluate information, evaluate how something should be. We say that all the should statements live in thinking and feeling, meaning that the world should be a certain way. That's why you're making a decision on it or evaluating it. You're determining what should be as opposed to what is. Your perceiving or learning process in sensing and intuition, that more lives in the realm of what is, how things could be, how things manifest, but you're not making any evaluation on it. You're not deciding anything about it. You're just observing and speculating and thinking of different ideas. Thinking and feeling are where you decide how to act and what to do about it and what should be unfolding. And the difference between the two is that thinking bases all the should statements on impersonal criteria, and feeling bases all those decisions on feeling or personal criteria. So it's not that one is logical and the other is emotional. They're both equally logical and emotional depending upon the context and how you want to parse everything out. It's more what am I going to ultimately and fundamentally use as my decision-making evaluation? So one of the things you can look at in behavior when you're passively profiling someone is a person's tonality when they're talking about a subject that is important to them. A thinker will try to get to the most impersonal place possible. The more important the topic, the more flat their voice becomes. If you notice for me, and I've talked about this in other podcasts, I'm an ENTP. When I'm just hanging out and I'm casual, I have a tendency to have a far more inflection in my voice. I mean, I have some inflection. Obviously, you can hear it right now. I have some inflection in my voice when it comes to the podcast. But the more data-oriented the piece of information I'm giving, the more precise I'm trying to be, the flatter my voice gets. Whereas for a feeler, the more important the topic is, the more sing-songy the voice gets, the more up and downs and lilting tones. A part of this is because a feeler, when they're persuading another person or talking about something important to them, they're going to try to be as attractive as possible. They're going to try to impel the other person to come to their side based on certain persuasive tactics or attractors. Whereas a thinker is going to believe that they'll be persuasive if they use as neutral territory as humanly possible, because we all overvalue our own experience. Like for me, I'm most persuaded by raw, analytical, emotionally neutral data. So therefore you must be too. And so I'm going to present it in a way that would strike me. And so I'm going to present it to you in a flat tone, which is what I would be looking for. Whereas a feeler knows that they're going to be more persuaded by an emotional appeal or something that is shown from the other person to be very important to them by packing it full of an emotional experience or a personal experience. And so therefore a lilting quality, an up and down, an emotional appeal in the voice is going to be, and as far as they're concerned, the most impactful, because that would be the most impactful to them. These are all deeply unconscious. They don't mean anything specific. They're just strategies that we naturally pick up based on what strikes us and what we overvalue as people. So one of the things you can use to determine thinking and feeling is how flat or how sing-songy or lilting or up and down in tonality a person's voice gets when they're talking about a subject that's important to them.
And just like all of these, there's exceptions to what Antonia's talking about. If a thinker is an actor, for example, or been trained to present from the stage in a very persuasive way, the seat of motivation is often emotion. And so they may have trained themselves to speak, especially when they're trying to be persuasive, in a more sing-songy or more inflected tonality. So it's not always 100%. That's why we talk about the cognitive functions and other things that are happening, not just what you see as and observe as behavior. There's other things happening here at the wiring level. And again, if a feeler is presenting maybe at a scientific conference or a very technical place, they might have a very flat tone to how they're presenting that information because they're tapping into that part of themselves. So this doesn't work 100% of the time, but these are indicators, these are trends, especially if you're in a social setting, like you're meeting somebody or on a date or something. These are some things you can look for often to be indicators of type, but they're not 100% because we might have trained ourselves into something different or showing up in a different way. So just keep that in mind. And all of these aren't bulletproof. These are just tendencies. So let's go to that last letter set, which is going to be either J for judger or P for perceiver. And what this is indicating, whether you're a J or a P, it's indicating how you organize your world. Which world to you is organized, I should say. So what judgers often do is judgers will organize their external world because they want to have inner world freedom. So this is a little different than the introversion, extraversion piece, which is about energy. This is more about organization, the structure of things. So a judger, for example, in order to go into their office and work every day and have the ability to let their mind be free to express itself or to think the thoughts it needs to think, they need to have their outer world very organized and use their outer world as reference points for their inner experience. For example, they have a filing system most likely, or a way they put their things away, or the way their desk is organized, because the inner world is allowed to wander. Now, flip that for a perceiver. They organize their inner world and their thought processes and their emotions in order to be able to express themselves or have freedom in the outside world. So a perceiver might look extremely messy. You might walk into a perceiver's office and there's papers everywhere and everything's in disarray, but you ask them a question and they might be able to go and find that one paper in that stack because inside of their mind they have tagged where that piece of paper might be. So you can see they're both organizing things. They're just doing it in different ways. And so a perceiver, again, is organizing their inner world and experience so they can have outer world freedom. And a judger is organizing their outer world to have inner world freedom.
However, to use the general criteria that most people determine judger versus perceiver, which is an organized office versus a messy office, or an organized car versus a messy car, that is also a red herring.
Or being on time versus being late.
That's right. When we talk about perceivers and whether or not, say, they're on time, it's entirely possible that their decision-making cognitive function, which for perceivers is either introverted thinking or introverted feeling, that the concept or the behavior of being on time has somehow gotten integrated into that process. And so they will never be late. They will never be late because somehow that just struck them as subjectively important. And the same thing could be said, say, with judgers and cleanliness. It depends on the type, but there are certain judgers that actually have a quite high threshold for chaos around them. And they've just learned how to tune it out in order to stay, say, in whatever, process they want to stay in internally and just not have to look at the outside world. So at our healthiest, we will have certain trends of behavior of organization versus disorganization. We're talking about the subterranean mental wiring. We're talking about the stuff that goes way unconscious for us. That is fundamentally the building block of everything that gets put on top of it. But what gets put on top of it may change depending upon context and programming and things that just strike you as important and what you grew up with and had to build strategies and skills around dealing with, etc. So some judgers can just have absolutely disaster homes, and some perceivers can have absolutely rigorous homes. So that is one of the worst criteria to use, even though it hits or strikes at the heart of the differences between the types. A much more, I would say a much more useful criteria to use is once again going back to a person's physicality and how they're showing up in ways that are very unconscious for them. Perceivers, because the outside world is the world to be explored. It's the world that is the place where improvisation happens. Perceivers have a tendency to be very comfortable with a more fluid sense of motion. They're a lot less determined to make sure that their body is going in certain tighter movements. So what does that look like? A perceiver is far more likely to sit with one foot underneath the other leg. They have more of comfort, even if they're introverts, of slouching their arm over like a couch headrest. They're a lot more kind of they just have a fluidity about their motions in the outside world. And the reason why is because if something comes at them in the outside world, they need a lot less lead time to be able to react or respond to it. That's really what it comes down to, is being able to turn on a dime. So there's a casualness with the outside world. There's just sort of I'm just going to sit however I want to sit. I'm just going to slouch if I want to slouch. I'm just going to kick my feet up and I'm going to kick my arms up. And I'm just going to have a very casual relationship with the outside world. Whereas judgers need more lead time to be able to respond to certain situations. And so a judger has a tendency to have more precision of movement. They're going based on almost like templatized motions with their body, because those templatized motions are the ones that will help them respond to something that they don't have necessarily reaction time to respond to. And so there's a precision about their movements. That's the same thing happens with their clothing choices. There's a precision or preparedness about their clothing choices. Whereas a perceiver, there's more of a throw it together and see what happens with their clothing choices.
You can see this exemplified on the freeway. A perceiver is more likely, let's say there's an exit coming up for the perceiver to exit the freeway. A perceiver might sit in the left lane here in the United States, as an example, and not get all the way over to that exit lane until the very last moment. They know it's coming up, but they're okay. They can react in real time. And then you see them cross 3 lanes of traffic into the exit lane at the last moment to get off the exit on the freeway. Whereas a judger might see the sign. And these are trends, not always across the board, but a judger might see the signs 2 miles down the road. In 2 miles, your exit's coming off. And they begin the process at that point to move themselves over into the right lane and preparing themselves for exit. Even though it might slow them down because they got to get behind that slow truck, they're in the correct lane to exit, and they don't have to rely on an instant reactionary time. They can plan their movements ahead of time before those movements are needed. So a lot of sequencing comes into this. And a lot of step 1, step 2, step 3 happens for judgers, whereas perceivers try to do things more random access.
Right. There's a comfort with in-the-moment improvisation with their physicality that perceivers have that judgers don't generally have. So trends of dress will go back and forth between judging trends of dress and perceiving trends of dress. Like I think about my father, who's an ESTP, and he is of the silent generation, and he's of the generation that lived through a very strong conformity message. So my dad has always had very like his entire visage, the way he dresses, how he does his hair, looks very judger. It could throw a person off. But my father's physicality is one of great comfort with the environment. He does a lot of just kind of like slouching on his elbow, and he does a lot of kicking his feet up, and he does a lot of just sort of having a very casual relationship with his body in the outside world. It doesn't really bother him. He doesn't feel like that is in any way putting him in a threatening position. Whereas my mom was raised in a more, she's a baby boomer, and so she was raised during a time period in the 60s that encouraged people to be very self-expressive. So my mom has a tendency to be more self-expressive in how she dresses because that was her time period. But you can see there's a conservation of movement with her, that she's more precise than he is, that she's more careful in her motions, and she goes just a little slower than he does.
She's an INFJ.
And she's an INFJ, exactly. Thank you. So sometimes dress can throw people off, but the precision of motion versus the casualness with the environment around you. And these are things that it takes a little while to calibrate to. Like, what does that mean to have a casualness of space or casualness of body? And oftentimes you have to train your eye to be able to notice the details of somebody who's like mildly slouchy versus somebody who's like sitting more rigid. Somebody who's sitting more in like a precision way versus somebody who has like no problem just, like maybe even turning their back to a room. That's another piece, is that judgers have a tendency to want to sit facing a room so they can see what's coming, whereas perceivers just unconsciously will sit with their back to the room because they don't have on their radar as much being able to see what's coming. So there are certain little physical indicators of a judger versus a perceiver that takes a little bit more nuance, but you can really start telling them when you've calibrated your eye to look for them.
You can tell that, and you might be a little confused here. You guys are talking about how they're free in the outer world as a perceiver, but then you just talked about introvert extroverts and the outer world, inner world. Now I'm getting confused. Is it possible for a perceiver to also be an introvert? And is it possible for a judger to be an extrovert? And obviously, yes, the answer is yes, the short answer. And there are things there's little behaviors, again, that you're looking for when you're passively profiling that to the instant observer, the newbie, can often look similar in how they're showing up. But there are little nuances you're looking for in that passive process of profiling somebody. They're little indicators that might look like one thing, but you're actually observing something else. And this is where hopefully these ideas we've given you today can help you to see some of these distinctions. Just because someone's comfortable in the outer environment or in a party atmosphere doesn't necessarily mean they're an extrovert. They might just be a perceiver, for example. And maybe they're doing a lot of chatting, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily an extrovert. They're maybe an introvert that is trying to control the conversation. So there's all these little nuances and differences between these things that, again, when you get down to the cognitive function level underneath these 4 letters that we all deal with all the time, that's where the gold is mined, because it gives you a true fidelity of how the mind is wired, not just the behaviors exhibiting.
Right. So hopefully that was helpful. And if you're trying to become a better, you're trying to get better at typing people, that should get you started. And those are some of the things that we've noticed that help with some of the misnomers around the dichotomies. We're trying to point out some red herrings, some things that we have a tendency to think are signs of type, but might actually be throwing you off because they could be indicators of something irrelevant. What we talked about with these 4 dichotomies are the things that we believe are like foundational components to passive profiling. So hopefully that really helped, that helped you out some in your typing. So we want to talk a little bit about Profiler Training Certification course. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on here. We just want to give you some concepts around it, especially if you're a podcast listener and you maybe haven't visited our website or don't know much about what we do here at Personality Hacker. We believe that profiling and getting an accurate assessment for somebody else's type, and then being able to share the insights that come along with understanding and knowledge of your type, is a very powerful tool. And there are certain people who really benefit from being able to do a massive deep dive of this subject. So people who join the Profiler Training Certification course have a tendency to be coaches, they're business owners, they're people who would like to maybe get into doing profile verification sessions with Personality Hacker to be able to have that as, a supplement to their career. There are people who really love going down, like they just love profiling, they love typology, and they want to use it in a more career-oriented fashion. So we created the Profiler Training Certification course in order to help people get to the highest level of proficiency in their profiling. And one of the challenges is that if you are super duper into this, sometimes you have to relearn some things that you thought you knew about typology and profiling. Like we mentioned, the red herrings. If a person is social, they must be an extrovert. If they are a person who's not social, they must be an introvert. That's a red herring. So sometimes you have to recalibrate to some of these foundational or subterranean concepts. So we put together Profiler Training Certification course, and it's I'm not gonna lie, it's a behemoth of a course. It is a massive investment. It's an investment of time and money. The Profiler Training course is, I think all totaled, it's about 60 different sessions. I think all totaled in everything that you get.
The challenge is we keep expanding on it and adding more to it every year.
Yeah. So
that we open it up. So it
hard,
keeps growing.
It's hard to say how many sessions it is. The core course itself is over 40 sessions, and then we add supplemental pieces on top of it. And so it is a massive investment of time. It generally takes most people 6 months to get through if they're doing a session a week. And some people go faster. They pile it all in. Like I know some people who went through it in 2 weeks, and that's all they focused on. They went through it in 2 weeks, and then they went through it again and again and again. I know some people have gone through it like 4 or 5 times because they're really serious about using it in their practices. And for some people, they go slower, and it takes them more like 6 months to a year to get through it. The recommendation is that as you're going through it, you are just doing implementation like crazy. All the sessions come with exercises that, in order to get certified, a certificate of completion, you have to have done all the exercises. And then in order to be a certified profiler, you have to go through a secondary portion that qualifies you as one of our profilers. But it's a huge course. And so if that's something that's interesting to you, then awesome, keep listening. And if not, that's totally cool too. It's also an investment of money. And this is going to be something that we keep on the podcast in rotation, and in case the tuition alters, we don't want to give the price on the podcast. But if you want to go find out how much it is, go to profilertraining.com and fill out the interest form, and then you get all of the pieces of information that you might want. And you also go through a series of videos that gives you an overview of what the course looks like. Then please feel free to sign up for the interest list, and then we'll keep you informed on what's going on.
Yeah, profilertraining.com is the place to go for that. And even if you don't decide to invest in the course right now, there's a lot of great information Just watching some of the videos or reading some of the articles on that site will help you be a better passive profiler. And just taking that information for what it is. Our hearts are wanting to give out great information that's useful for people to better their lives, understand themselves, and help understand each other. And even that process of just going through some of those free videos there, I think will really benefit you as a person. So I encourage you to do that, even if you're not interested in the course directly right now.
Yeah. Another thing is that we have certified profilers that help us do our profile verifications. So if you go through the course and you get certified and you become qualified to be one of our profilers, you could actually do what we do. And we pay you for that. Not that we can guarantee that will happen with every single person, because not everybody goes to the level of qualification. But we do have a couple of profilers on staff that have gone through profiler training, and they're the ones who are our right-hand men when it comes to profile verification sessions. And it happens to be that every person who works with Personality Hacker at this point has been a profiler training student at one time. And the reason for that is any person who comes to work with us has to go through that process anyway, because you have to know what you're talking about and know what you're doing if you're going to be on staff. And so what we do is we use profiler training students to be our pool of talent, so to speak. And we groom people from the profiler training certification course. If they go all the way and complete the process, we start to groom them for different things that we might need if that comes up. Now, again, we can't promise anything, but if you've ever thought about working with Personality Hacker, that is not a bad place to start. And if you have any more questions, please shoot us an email. You can find all the contact information at personalityhacker.com, and go check out profilertraining.com to get more information on that.
And what do you think about this week's podcast? Have you been passively profiling people? Have you gotten yourself into trouble, maybe thinking somebody's one type and they're actually a different type? I mean, what's your experience with this? We want to hear from you. Your voice is needed. Your voice is important. Come over to personalityhacker.com. You can leave a comment or ask a question directly below this show. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we will talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.